I brought my wife coffee at her CEO office. When I told the security guard I was her husband, he laughed and said, "Sir, her husband is here every day." Then he pointed at the man walking out of the elevator. That's when I decided to play along. But before we get to that, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought a simple surprise visit would shatter everything I believed about my 28-year marriage. My name is Arthur. I'm 56 years old, and until that Thursday afternoon in October, I thought I knew my wife Clara better than anyone in the world. It started as such an innocent idea. Clara had been working late again, pulling those 12 and 14-hour days that came with being CEO of Apex Innovations. I'd been making dinner for one too many nights, eating alone while she texted me updates about board meetings and client emergencies. That morning, she'd rushed out without her usual coffee, and I thought bringing her favorite latte and homemade sandwich might brighten her day. The downtown office building gleamed in the autumn sunlight as I pulled into the visitor parking space. I'd only been to Clara's office a handful of times over the years. She always said it was easier to keep work and home separate, and I respected that boundary. Maybe I respected too many boundaries. I walked through the glass doors carrying the coffee and brown bag, feeling oddly nervous. The lobby was all marble and chrome, the kind of intimidating corporate space that made me grateful for my quiet accounting practice. A security guard sat behind an imposing desk, his nameplate reading Marcus. "Good afternoon," I said, approaching with what I hoped was a confident smile. "I'm here to see Clara Vance. I'm her husband, Arthur." Marcus looked up from his computer screen, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to something I couldn't quite read. He tilted his head slightly, studying my face as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You said you're Mrs. Vance's husband." His voice carried a note of confusion that made my stomach tighten. "Yes, that's right, Arthur Vance. I brought her lunch." I held up the bag, suddenly feeling foolish. Marcus's expression changed completely. His eyebrows shot up and then he did something that froze my blood. He laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a genuine, bewildered laugh that echoed through the marble lobby. "Sir, I'm sorry, but I see Mrs. Vance's husband every day. He just left about 10 minutes ago." Marcus gestured toward the elevators with casual certainty. "There he is now, coming back." I turned, following his gaze, and watched a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit stride through the lobby. He was younger than me, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of confident bearing that seemed to own every room he entered. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him screamed success and authority. The man nodded to Marcus with familiar ease. "Afternoon, Marcus. Clara asked me to grab those files from the car." "No problem, Mr. Vance. She's in her office." Julian Vance. I knew that name from Clara's work stories. Her vice president who joined the company 3 years ago, the man she occasionally mentioned in passing, always in a professional context. Julian this, Julian that, always business. My hands felt numb around the coffee cup. The brown bag crinkled as my grip tightened involuntarily. Everything in me wanted to speak up, to correct this massive misunderstanding, but my voice had completely abandoned me. Marcus was looking between Julian and me now, genuine confusion creasing his features. "I'm sorry, sir, but are you sure you're Mrs. Vance's husband? Because Mr. Vance here is married to her." The words hit me like physical blows. Married to her. Present tense. Not was married, not claims to be married, but a simple, matter-of-fact statement that shattered my reality. Julian paused mid-stride, his attention drawn to our conversation. When his eyes met mine, I saw something flicker across his face. Not guilt, not surprise, but recognition. He knew exactly who I was. "Is there a problem here?" Julian's voice was smooth, controlled, the voice of a man accustomed to managing difficult situations. Something cold and calculating passed through my mind in that moment. Every instinct screamed at me to explode, to demand answers, to create the scene this situation deserved. But a deeper wisdom, born from 28 years of reading people in my accounting practice, told me to play along. "Oh, you must be Julian," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Clara's mentioned you. I'm Arthur, a friend of the family." The lie tasted bitter, but it bought me time to think. I was just dropping off some documents for Clara. Julian's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained watchful. "Ah, yes, Clara's mentioned you too. Had she? What had she said?" "She's in meetings most of the afternoon, but I can make sure she gets whatever you brought." I handed over the coffee and sandwich, my movements mechanical. "Just tell her Arthur stopped by." "Of course." Julian's smile was perfectly professional, perfectly normal, as if we hadn't just had the most surreal conversation of my life. I walked back to my car in a daze, my legs moving without conscious direction. The October air felt sharp against my skin, but I barely noticed. Everything looked the same as when I'd arrived 30 minutes ago, but my world had fundamentally shifted. Sitting in the driver's seat, I stared at the office building through my windshield. 28 years of marriage, 28 years of sharing a bed, a home, dreams, fears, inside jokes that nobody else understood. 28 years of believing I knew this woman completely. My phone buzzed with a text from Clara. "Running late again tonight. Don't wait up, love you." Love you. The words that had once brought me comfort now felt like another lie in what was apparently a web of deception I'd been blind to. How long had this been going on? How many times had Julian been introduced as her husband while I sat at home making dinner for one, believing her stories about late meetings and business dinners? I started the car and drove home through familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign. Our house looked the same. The red brick colonial we'd bought when Clara first made partner at her previous firm. The garden she'd insisted on planting our second year there. The mailbox with both our names printed in careful script. Everything exactly as I'd left it, except now I knew it was all built on lies. Inside, the silence felt different. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a home waiting for its occupants to return. It was the hollow emptiness of a stage set, a carefully constructed facade. I walked through rooms filled with our shared memories, vacation photos, wedding pictures, the ceramic bowl Clara had made in that pottery class she'd taken 5 years ago. Had any of it been real? I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. My mind kept replaying the scene at the office, searching for clues I'd missed, explanations that might make sense of what I'd witnessed. But there was only one explanation that fit, and it was one I wasn't ready to accept. The front door opened at 9:30, just as it had countless times before. Clara's heels clicked against the hardwood floor, her keys jangled as she set them on the hall table. Normal sounds of a normal evening, except nothing was normal anymore. "Arthur, I'm home." Her voice carried the tired warmth I'd grown accustomed to over the years. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking every inch the successful CEO in her tailored navy suit, her blonde hair still perfectly arranged despite her long day. "How was your day?" I asked, the question automatic. She sighed, loosening her jacket. "Exhausting, back-to-back meetings all afternoon." "Did you eat already?" I nodded, studying her face for any sign of deception, any hint that she knew about my visit to her office. There was nothing. Her expression was exactly what it had always been, tired, distracted, but genuinely glad to see me. "I brought you coffee today," I said carefully, "to your office." Clara paused in the middle of reaching for a glass. For just a fraction of a second, something shifted in her expression. Then she smiled. "You did? I didn't get any coffee." I gave it to Julian to pass along. Another pause, so brief I might have imagined it. Oh, Julian mentioned someone stopped by. I had back-to-back meetings all afternoon, so I probably missed it. She moved to the refrigerator, her back to me. That was sweet of you to think of me. I watched her pour herself a glass of wine, noting how her hands remained perfectly steady. Either she was telling the truth, or she was the most accomplished liar I'd ever met. After 28 years of marriage, I was terrified to discover which one it was. The rest of the evening passed in a surreal pantomime of normalcy. We watched the news together, discussed our weekend plans, went through the same bedtime routine we'd followed for decades. But underneath it all, a terrible new awareness pulsed like a second heartbeat. As Clara slept beside me, her breathing deep and peaceful, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how many other lies I'd been living with. How many times had she come home from spending the day being Julian's wife, only to slip seamlessly back into being mine? How long had I been sharing my life with someone who was living a completely different one when I wasn't around? The numbers man in me started calculating. 3 years since Julian joined the company. How many late nights? How many business trips? How many times had she mentioned his name in passing, conditioning me to accept his presence in her professional life while he was actually inhabiting something much more personal? But the questions that haunted me most weren't about timelines or evidence. They were simpler and infinitely more devastating. Who was the woman sleeping next to me? And who had I been married to all these years? The next morning arrived with cruel normalcy. Clara kissed my cheek before leaving for work. The same quick peck she'd given me for years. She wore her favorite perfume, the one I'd bought her for Christmas 2 years ago. Everything about her was familiar, comforting, exactly as it had always been, except now I knew I was kissing a stranger. I called my office and told my assistant I'd be working from home. For the first time in my 15-year practice, I couldn't bear the thought of discussing tax returns and quarterly reports. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that grew cold while I stared at Clara's coffee mug in the sink. She'd used it that morning, just like always. Had she been thinking about Julian while she drank from it? By noon, I found myself doing something I'd never done before, going through Clara's things. Not frantically, not desperately, but with the methodical precision that had made me successful in accounting. I started with the obvious places: her home office, the desk where she sometimes worked in the evenings. The drawers revealed nothing suspicious. Work papers, company letterhead, business cards from clients I recognized from her stories. Everything was exactly what it should be for a CEO who occasionally brought work home. But then I found something that made my stomach clench. A restaurant receipt from Le Jardin, the French place downtown where we'd celebrated our anniversary 3 years running, dated 6 weeks ago for 2 people, $68.50. I remembered that night clearly because Clara had told me she was having dinner with a potential client, a female client from Portland who was in town for just one evening. I stared at the receipt, my hands trembling slightly. The timestamp showed 8:15 p.m. We talked on the phone that night around 9:30. She'd sounded relaxed, happy, describing her challenging but productive client meeting. I'd been proud of her for landing what she described as a significant account. But this wasn't a business dinner receipt. No alcohol charges that would accompany client entertainment. No appetizers or desserts that Clara would order to impress a potential client. Just 2 entrees and a bottle of wine. The kind of intimate dinner I thought was reserved for us. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Clara's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, honey," I answered, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. "Hey, I just wanted to check in. You sounded a little off this morning." Her voice carried genuine concern, the kind of caring attention that had made me fall in love with her 29 years ago. "Just tired," I said. "Didn't sleep well." "Maybe you should take a real break today. You've been working so hard lately." The irony of her suggestion wasn't lost on me. While I'd been working hard at my small practice, she'd apparently been working hard at maintaining two separate lives. Actually, I was thinking about that dinner you had with the client from Portland, the one about 6 weeks ago. How did that work out? A pause, so brief that most people wouldn't notice it. But after 28 years of marriage, I knew Clara's speech patterns. She was calculating. Oh, it didn't pan out the way we'd hoped. She decided to go with a local firm. Her voice remained steady, casual. Why do you ask? Just curious. You seemed excited about it at the time. Well, you win some, you lose some. I could hear typing in the background. She was probably answering emails while talking to me, multitasking the way she always did. I should get back to this board meeting prep. See you tonight. See you tonight. After she hung up, I sat staring at the receipt. Either she was lying about the client meeting, or she was lying about the dinner. Either way, she was lying. I spent the rest of the afternoon like a detective in my own life, examining familiar things with new eyes. The credit card statements I'd always glanced at casually, trusting Clara to handle our finances since she made 3 times what I did. Now I studied them line by line. Lunch charges on days when she told me she was brown bagging it to save money. Gas station purchases in neighborhoods across town, far from her usual routes. A charge at Barnes & Noble for $37.12 on a Tuesday afternoon when she'd supposedly been in back-to-back meetings. Clara hadn't bought a book for pleasure reading in years, claiming she was too tired after work to focus on anything but trade magazines. But the most damning discovery came from her laptop. She'd left it open on the kitchen counter, something she'd been doing more frequently over the past year. I told myself I was just closing it to save battery, but my eyes caught a notification bubble in the corner of the screen. Julian Vance had sent her a calendar invitation. I shouldn't have clicked on it. I knew I was crossing a line, violating her privacy in a way that would have horrified me just 24 hours earlier. But 24 hours earlier, I'd believed my wife was faithful. The calendar invitation was for dinner. Tonight, 7:00 p.m. at the Gilded Vine, the Italian place that had become our special occasion restaurant, the place where I had proposed to Clara 17 years ago. The reservation was under Julian's name. My chest felt tight as I scrolled through more calendar entries. Lunch meetings with Julian that weren't labeled as business. Doctor's appointments that Clara had never mentioned to me. A weekend spa retreat 3 months ago that she'd told me was a women's conference for female executives. But the entries that made me physically nauseous were the recurring ones. Coffee with Julian every Tuesday morning at 8:00 a.m. Dinner plans every other Thursday. Weekend planning marked for this coming Saturday when Clara had told me she needed to work. I was looking at a parallel life, meticulously scheduled and carefully hidden. Julian wasn't just her work colleague or even her affair partner. Based on these calendar entries, he was her primary relationship. I was the side note, the obligation, the inconvenience worked around. The garage door rumbled open at 6:15. Clara was home early, unusual for a Thursday. I closed the laptop quickly, my heart hammering as I heard her heels on the kitchen tile. "You're home early," I said, hoping my voice sounded normal. She looked beautiful, I realized with a sharp pang. She'd refreshed her makeup. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she was wearing the black dress I'd bought her for her birthday last year. The dress she'd said was too fancy for everyday wear. I managed to wrap up early for once. She moved past me to the refrigerator, her perfume trailing behind her. "I thought maybe we could grab dinner out tonight. It's been forever since we did anything spontaneous." The lie was so smooth, so perfectly delivered that I almost believed it myself. If I hadn't seen the calendar invitation, I would have been thrilled by her suggestion. I would have rushed to change clothes, grateful for this unexpected attention from my successful, busy wife. Where did you have in mind? I asked. Oh, I don't know. Maybe that new sushi place on 5th Street. Or we could try something completely different. She was checking her phone as she spoke, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. I watched her type, wondering if she was texting Julian. Was she canceling their dinner, rescheduling? Or was this part of some elaborate game I couldn't even begin to understand? Actually, she said, looking up from her phone with apparent disappointment, I just remembered I have that conference call with the Tokyo office. It totally slipped my mind. She shook her head ruefully. Rain check. Of course. The words came out automatically, but inside something cold and hard was crystallizing. What time is your call? 7:30. Could run until 9 or 10. You know how these international things go. She was already moving toward the stairs, toward our bedroom where she kept her work clothes. I'll probably just grab something quick on my way back to the office. I nodded, playing my part in this elaborate deception. I'll make myself something here. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at me with what appeared to be genuine affection. You're so understanding, Arthur. I don't know what I'd do without you. The words that should have warmed my heart instead felt like ice picks. How many times had she said variations of this while preparing to spend the evening with another man? How many times had I smiled and kissed her goodbye, unknowingly sending her off to her real life? I watched her climb the stairs, listening to her movements in our bedroom. She was changing out of the black dress, probably into something more businesslike for her conference call, or maybe into something entirely different for her dinner with Julian. 20 minutes later, she came back down wearing a navy blouse and dark slacks, professional but attractive. Her makeup was perfect, her hair touched up. She looked like a woman preparing for an important evening, not someone settling in for a long phone conference. I'll try not to be too late, she said, kissing my cheek. The same spot she'd kissed that morning, but now it felt like a betrayal instead of intimacy. Take your time. I'll probably turn in early anyway. She gathered her purse, her laptop bag, her keys. The same routine I'd watched thousands of times. But now I knew I was watching an actress preparing to leave one performance for another. The house felt different after she left. Not empty, but haunted. Every familiar object seemed to mock me with its false comfort. The wedding photos on the mantel, the vacation souvenirs on the bookshelf, the coffee table we'd picked out together 10 years ago. All of it was real, but none of it meant what I'd thought it meant. I made myself a sandwich and sat in front of the television, but I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept circling back to the same impossible questions. How long had this been going on? How had I missed the signs for so long? And most devastatingly, had our entire marriage been a lie, or had something changed along the way? At 8:30, I found myself driving past the Gilded Vine. I told myself I was just going to the grocery store, that this route was perfectly normal. But when I saw Clara's silver BMW in the restaurant parking lot, parked next to a dark Mercedes I assumed belonged to Julian, the last thread of hope I'd been clinging to snapped. They were in there right now, sharing the same kind of intimate dinner I thought was exclusive to our marriage. Was he telling her he loved her? Was she laughing at his jokes the way she used to laugh at mine? Were they planning a future that didn't include me? I drove home in a daze, the weight of my new reality settling around me like a heavy coat. My wife of 28 years was living a double life so complete, so seamlessly integrated, that I'd been completely blind to it. The woman I'd thought I knew better than anyone was a stranger. The marriage I'd believed was solid was apparently just the cover story for her real relationship. But perhaps the most shattering realization was this. I had no idea how long I'd been living this lie, and I had no idea what to do about it. The revelation came 3 days later in the most mundane way possible. I was cleaning out the junk drawer in the kitchen, something I did quarterly to keep our household organized, when my fingers closed around a key I didn't recognize. It was brass, worn smooth at the edges. attached to a keychain from Crestwood Residences across town. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. We owned our house outright, had for the past 8 years. Neither of us had any reason to have an apartment key, let alone one from a complex 30 minutes away from our neighborhood. That afternoon, while Clara was at what she'd called a client presentation, I drove to Crestwood Residences. The complex was nice, upscale, but not ostentatious, the kind of place where successful professionals might keep a discreet second residence. I sat in my car in the visitor parking area, staring at the key in my palm and wondering if I really wanted to know what door it opened. The answer came when I saw Julian's Mercedes pull into a numbered space. I watched him get out carrying a grocery bag and what looked like dry cleaning. He moved with the easy familiarity of someone coming home, not someone visiting. When he disappeared into Building C, I waited exactly 10 minutes before following. The key fit perfectly into apartment 214. The door opened onto a life I never knew existed. It wasn't a temporary hiding place or a secret meeting spot. It was a home. A fully furnished, lived-in home with photos on the mantel, books on the shelves, and Clara's favorite throw pillows arranged on a couch I'd never seen before. But it was the photos that destroyed me completely. Clara and Julian at what looked like a company Christmas party, his arm around her waist in a possessive, intimate way. The two of them on a beach I didn't recognize, both tanned and relaxed, Clara wearing a sundress I'd never seen, Julian kissing her cheek while she laughed, her left hand visible and notably bare of the wedding ring she wore at home. I moved through the apartment like a ghost, cataloging evidence of a relationship that was clearly far more than an affair. This was a second life, complete and established. In the bedroom, Clara's clothes hung next to Julian's in a shared closet. Her perfume sat on the dresser next to his cologne. The bathroom held 2 toothbrushes, her contact solution, the expensive face cream she claimed was too costly to repurchase when she'd run out 6 months ago. On the kitchen counter, I found the most devastating evidence of all. A folder labeled future plans in Clara's handwriting. Inside were house listings in Julian's name, vacation brochures for trips I'd never heard her mention, and a business plan for expanding Apex Innovations with Julian listed as CEO and Clara as president. But at the bottom of the folder was something that made my hands shake. A consultation summary from Chen and Associates, Family Law. The letterhead was familiar because Chen and Associates was the firm that had handled our will updates 5 years ago. According to the summary, Clara had met with them twice in the past 4 months to discuss optimal divorce strategies for high-asset individuals. The document outlined her approach in clinical detail. She planned to file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and emotional abandonment. The strategy involved establishing a pattern of my alleged emotional unavailability, supported by what the lawyer called lifestyle incompatibility evidence. According to this plan, my preference for quiet evenings at home would be presented as social isolation. My satisfaction with my small accounting practice would become lack of ambition. My contentment with our modest lifestyle would be reframed as inability to support her professional growth. But the most chilling part was the timeline. Clara had been planning this divorce for at least 2 years, carefully documenting instances of what she called my withdrawn behavior. She'd been creating a narrative of our marriage that painted me as an inadequate husband who'd gradually become emotionally unavailable. The woman I'd been living with, loving, trusting, had been systematically building a case against me while I remained completely oblivious. I sat on their couch, surrounded by evidence of their shared life, and tried to process the magnitude of the deception. This wasn't just an affair that had gotten out of hand. This was a calculated replacement of one life with another. Julian hadn't just stolen my wife. He'd systematically assumed my role while I was gradually being written out of the story. My phone buzzed with a text from Clara. "Running late tonight. Don't wait up, love you." Love you. The same words she'd probably texted me from this very apartment. Maybe while Julian was cooking dinner in their kitchen, or while they were planning their next vacation together. How many times had she sent me loving messages while actively living a completely different life? I photographed everything with my phone, my accountant's mind automatically creating the documentation I'd need later. The photos, the legal documents, the evidence of their shared residence. But as I worked, a strange calm settled over me. For days, I'd been tormented by uncertainty, by the gap between what I knew and what I suspected. Now I had answers, and while they were devastating, they were also clarifying. Clara hadn't just been having an affair. She'd been conducting an elaborate, long-term plan to transition from one life to another, with me as the unwitting supporting character in my own replacement. The woman I'd been married to for 28 years had spent the last several years methodically erasing me from her future while maintaining the facade of our marriage. When I got home, I found Clara's laptop open on the kitchen counter again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened her email and found correspondence that confirmed everything I'd discovered at the apartment. Messages between Clara and Julian discussing when to make the transition. Communications with her lawyer about preparing Arthur for the inevitable changes. Even emails to our mutual friends, subtly preparing them for what she called some difficult decisions I'll need to make about my marriage. One email to her sister Patricia, dated just 2 weeks ago, was particularly devastating. Arthur's been so distant lately. I think he's going through some kind of midlife crisis, but he won't talk about it. I'm trying to be patient, but I can't sacrifice my own happiness indefinitely. Julian thinks I should consider all my options. Reading this, I realized that Clara hadn't just been living a double life. She'd been actively rewriting our marriage history to justify her planned exit. Every quiet evening I'd spent reading while she worked on her laptop. Every time I'd encouraged her to pursue her career ambitions, even when it meant less time together. Every instance of my being supportive rather than demanding, all of it had been transformed into evidence of my inadequacy as a husband. The cruelest part was recognizing how she'd manipulated my own responses to support her narrative. When she'd started working later and traveling more, I'd been understanding. When she'd seemed stressed and distant, I'd given her space. When she'd suggested we needed better communication, I'd agreed to couples counseling, never realizing I was providing her with material to use against me later. That night, Clara came home later than usual. Her face was tight with stress, her usual composed demeanor cracked around the edges. She set her briefcase down with more force than necessary. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I already knew. "Thomas Ellison called me this afternoon. The board is launching a corporate governance review." Her eyes were hard, accusing. Apparently someone raised concerns about unauthorized restructuring and undisclosed conflicts of interest. "I see. Don't play innocent, Arthur. They mentioned receiving information from a concerned party. You're the only one who would do something like this." I met her gaze steadily. I shared factual information about corporate reorganization that appeared to lack proper authorization, nothing more. "This is different. This affects my professional reputation, my ability to make a living. Your affair with Julian affects that too. The board was going to find out eventually that you've been restructuring the company to benefit your personal relationship. I just gave them a head start." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her reassessing everything she thought she knew about me. The passive, supportive husband who'd never challenged her decisions was gone. In his place was someone who understood the value of information and wasn't afraid to use it. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "I want you to stop treating me like I'm stupid," I said. "I want you to acknowledge that your actions have consequences beyond your personal happiness. And I want you to understand that I'm not going to quietly disappear just because it would be convenient for your new life plan." The next morning, I filed for divorce. But more importantly, I stopped being the man who made Clara's life easier at the expense of his own dignity. After 56 years of believing that love meant endless accommodation, I was finally learning that sometimes love means knowing when to stop. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new apartment, making coffee for one, and finding genuine peace in the simplicity of it. The morning sun streamed through windows I'd chosen, in a space that was entirely mine, free from the weight of deception and false harmony that had defined my life for so long. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks ago. Despite Clara's initial threats and manipulations, the evidence I'd gathered had shifted the entire dynamic of our settlement. When faced with documented proof of her adultery, financial deception, and professional misconduct, her lawyer had advised her to accept a more equitable division of assets than she'd originally planned. I kept the house, the one we'd shared for 20 years, but which I'd largely paid for with my contributions to our joint expenses. Clara kept her retirement accounts and half of our savings, minus the amount she'd spent on maintaining her secret life with Julian. It was fair in a way that her original divorce strategy would never have been. But the real satisfaction came not from the financial settlement, but from watching Clara face the consequences of choices she'd thought she could make without accountability. The corporate governance review at Apex Innovations had been thorough and devastating. While the board hadn't found anything criminally actionable, they discovered a pattern of unauthorized decision-making and undisclosed conflicts of interest that had seriously undermined Clara's credibility as a leader. Julian had been terminated immediately once his relationship with Clara became known to the board. His position as vice president had been contingent on his professional judgment being uncompromised by personal interests, and his romantic involvement with the CEO represented an irreconcilable conflict of interest. Clara had managed to keep her job, but barely. She'd been placed on probation. Her decision-making authority had been significantly restricted, and she was required to report to a newly appointed chief operating officer who essentially supervised her every move. The woman who'd built her identity around professional power and autonomy was now working under closer oversight than she'd experienced since her first corporate job 20 years ago. Their apartment at Crestwood Residences had been given up quietly. Julian had moved back to Seattle, taking a position with a smaller firm at considerably less money than he'd been making at Apex. Clara had moved into a modest one-bedroom place closer to her office, a significant downgrade from the luxury she'd become accustomed to. I learned about these developments not through direct contact, but through the small network of mutual friends and professional acquaintances that inevitably carries news in a city like ours. Some of these people had reached out to me after the divorce, expressing surprise at the circumstances, and in a few cases apologizing for having believed Clara's carefully constructed narrative about our marriage's decline. I had no idea, Patricia Wells, one of Clara's former colleagues, had told me when we'd run into each other at the grocery store. She made it sound like you'd grown apart gradually, like it was mutual. Nobody knew about Julian. These conversations had been validating in ways I hadn't expected. For months, I'd been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I'd really been as inadequate a husband as Clara had claimed. Learning that even her closest professional friends had been deceived helped me understand that her capacity for manipulation extended far beyond our marriage. But the most profound change wasn't in Clara's circumstances or in the validation I'd received from others. It was in my own relationship with myself. For the first time in decades, I was living without the constant undercurrent of someone else's dissatisfaction. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd been spending trying to anticipate Clara's needs, accommodate her moods, and compensate for whatever was missing in our relationship that I'd apparently been too dense to understand. My apartment was smaller than our house, but it felt spacious in ways that had nothing to do with square footage. I could read in the evening without worrying that my contentment with simple pleasures was somehow disappointing to someone who needed more stimulation. I could cook meals I actually wanted to eat instead of trying to impress someone who was probably texting her real partner while sitting across from me. I'd even started dating, something I'd thought would be impossible at 56 after 28 years of marriage. Evelyn was a widow I'd met through my church, a gentle woman who appreciated conversation about books and enjoyed quiet dinners without needing them to be productions. She found my contentment with simple pleasures charming rather than limiting, and her uncomplicated affection was a revelation after years of trying to earn love from someone who'd been systematically withdrawing it. The strangest part was realizing how much happier I was without the marriage I'd thought I'd been fighting to save. Clara had been right about one thing: we had grown incompatible, but not in the way she'd described. She'd become someone who could maintain elaborate deceptions while accepting love from someone she was actively betraying. I'd remained someone who believed in honesty, loyalty, and the possibility of working through problems together. Her version of growth required discarding the values that had built our marriage. My version of growth was learning to protect those values from people who would exploit them. One evening in late spring, I was sitting on the small balcony of my apartment, reading and enjoying the sunset when my phone rang. Clara's name appeared on the screen, the first time she'd called since our divorce was finalized. I almost didn't answer. We had nothing left to discuss, no shared obligations that required communication, but curiosity won. "Hello, Clara." "Arthur," her voice sounded tired, older somehow. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "What can I do for you?" There was a long pause. I wanted to apologize for how everything happened, for the way I handled things. I waited, saying nothing. "I know you probably don't want to hear this, but I've had a lot of time to think about what I did, about the choices I made." Another pause. "You didn't deserve what I put you through." "No, I didn't." I convinced myself that our marriage was already over, that I was just being honest about reality. But the truth is, I ended it long before I admitted it to myself. I ended it when I decided you weren't enough anymore, instead of trying to work with you to build something better. I found myself genuinely curious about this conversation. What's prompted this reflection? Clara let out a sound that might have been a laugh, but without humor. "Losing everything I thought I wanted. Julian and I lasted exactly 6 weeks after he moved to Seattle. Turns out our great love affair was more about the excitement of secrecy and the thrill of planning a new life than about actually wanting to live together day to day." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" She sounded genuinely curious. I considered the question honestly. "Yes, I am. I'm sorry you threw away 28 years for something that wasn't real. I'm sorry you hurt so many people in pursuit of something that didn't exist. I'm sorry you discovered too late that what we had was actually valuable. Do you ever think about what might have happened if I just talked to you? If I'd been honest about feeling restless instead of creating this whole elaborate deception?" "Sometimes," I admitted. "But Clara, the problem wasn't that you felt restless or wanted more from life. The problem was that you chose deception and betrayal instead of honest communication. You chose to replace me instead of working with me." "I know that now." "Do you? Because even in this apology, you're focusing on the outcome that didn't work out for you, not on the damage you caused along the way. You're sorry that your strategy failed, not sorry that your strategy involved systematically lying to someone who loved you." Silence stretched between us. "You're right," she said finally. "Even now I'm still making it about me." "Yes, you are." "I hope you're happy, Arthur. I hope you found someone who appreciates what I was too selfish to value." "I have. Her name is Evelyn, and she's everything you never were. Honest, kind, and capable of love without manipulation." "Good, you deserve that." After she hung up, I sat on my balcony as the sun finished setting, thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this peaceful evening. A year ago, I'd been living a lie without knowing it, married to someone who was systematically planning my replacement while accepting my love and support. Now I was alone but not lonely, starting over but not starting from scratch. I'd learned that contentment wasn't a character flaw, and that my capacity for loyalty and trust, while it had made me vulnerable to exploitation, was also what made me capable of real intimacy with someone who shared those values. Clara had seen my satisfaction with our quiet life as evidence of my limitations. Evelyn saw it as evidence of my ability to find joy in authentic connection, rather than needing constant external validation. The difference wasn't in what I offered, but in who was receiving it. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on something that would have surprised the Arthur of a year ago. I was grateful for Clara's betrayal, not because I'd enjoyed the pain of discovery or the difficulty of divorce, but because it had freed me from a relationship that was slowly killing my spirit. For years, I'd been trying to be enough for someone who had decided I wasn't. I'd been accepting love as a conditional gift that could be withdrawn if I failed to meet evolving standards I was never allowed to understand. I'd been living in fear of disappointing someone who was already planning my replacement. Now I was living with someone who loved me not despite my contentment with simple pleasures, but because of it. Someone who saw my loyalty as a gift rather than an expectation, my honesty as a treasure rather than a burden. At 56, I'd learned that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is losing something you thought you couldn't live without. Sometimes freedom comes disguised as loss, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling someone who's been systematically betraying you. Clara had been right about one thing. We both deserved to be with someone who truly understands us. She deserved someone capable of the same level of deception and manipulation that she was, and I deserved someone whose love didn't come with conditions, expiration dates, and exit strategies. As I turned off the lights in my small, honest apartment, I realized that for the first time in years, I was exactly where I belonged. If this story resonated with you, join our channel by liking and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one. The end.